Picture this. It's Christmas Eve, 1972, and your grandmother is standing in her tiny kitchen, staring at a nearly empty refrigerator and a wallet with maybe $5 left until payday. But somehow, someway, she's about to create a feast that would make your mouth water just thinking about it decades later. While today's families stress over elaborate Christmas spreads that cost hundreds of dollars, our grandmothers had a secret superpower that modern cooks have completely forgotten: the ability to transform humble, inexpensive ingredients into holiday magic that tasted better than anything money could buy. While we complain about grocery prices today, our grandmothers were feeding entire families on budgets that would shock you. How can we bring back the ingenuity of these Depression-era trained home cooks who were still feeding families during the economic uncertainties of the 60s and 70s? Christmas Eve salmon patties. Number 25 is something called Christmas Eve salmon patties, but these weren't made with fresh salmon. Your grandmother would buy the cheapest canned salmon she could find, usually the pink salmon that cost maybe 39 cents a can. She'd drain it, remove any bones, and mix it with breadcrumbs, an egg, chopped onions, and whatever seasonings she had in her spice cabinet. The magic happened when she formed these into patties and pan-fried them until golden brown. When the patties hit the hot skillet, the kitchen instantly filled with that unmistakable crackling sound that signaled something special was happening, even if the ingredients had come straight from the bargain shelf at the A&P. The scent alone brought people wandering in from other rooms, pretending they were just checking how things were going. If she had a lemon, she'd shave off a thin slice and squeeze out every last drop like it was liquid gold. If no lemon was around, she'd brighten it with a splash of vinegar that somehow tasted just as festive. Once they reached that perfect deep golden color, she'd stack them on a plate lined with a paper towel to blot off the grease, though somehow they still glistened. On Christmas Eve, these salmon patties felt like a delicacy, warm, savory, and comforting, the kind of food that made you realize magic didn't need to be expensive. It simply needed someone who knew how to turn a humble can into a holiday memory. Creamed chipped beef on toast. Number 24 brings us to creamed chipped beef on toast, affectionately known in many households by a name I can't say on this family-friendly channel. But despite its crude nickname, this dish was pure comfort food gold. Grandma would tear open that little glass jar or pouch of dried beef, the kind that always smelled salty and smoky even before it hit the pan. She'd snip the slices into thin ribbons with her kitchen scissors, the ones that rattled a little because the screw holding them together had loosened over the years. Butter would melt in the skillet, filling the room with a soft, nutty aroma that signaled the beginning of something good. Then came the flour, sprinkled with the confidence of a woman who didn't need measuring cups because her hands were the measuring cups. As she whisked in the milk, the mixture thickened slowly, and she could always tell exactly when it was ready just by how it clung to the spoon. The dried beef went in next, turning the pale sauce into a speckled pink and cream mixture that somehow tasted richer than the sum of its parts. Toast popped up from the old toaster, often a little unevenly browned, but nobody complained because this was Christmas Eve supper, and everyone knew to be grateful. When the sauce was ladled over the toast, it softened just enough to make every bite cozy without getting soggy. It wasn't fancy, but it carried the warmth of a dish handed down through hard times, military kitchens, and frugal households. Christmas hash. Moving to number 23, we have Christmas hash, which was basically Grandma's way of turning leftover potatoes and whatever protein she could find into something that felt festive. She'd start by pulling out leftover potatoes, often boiled days earlier and forgotten in a bowl at the back of the fridge. Rather than waste them, she'd chop them into little cubes, each one roughly the same size because she knew that even cooking was the key to great hash. If there was leftover ham, she'd dice it up. If not, she'd reach for that metal tin of bacon drippings she kept on the counter like a family heirloom. When the potatoes hit the hot skillet with a spoonful of that treasured grease, they sizzled in a way that instantly made the house feel warmer. As the edges crisped, she'd stir in onions until they softened and turned translucent, giving off that sweet, savory scent that drifted through the house. Sometimes she'd add peppers if she had them. But most of the time the dish was simple, honest, and built from whatever was on hand. Then came the magic moment. She'd crack a few eggs right over the sizzling hash, letting the whites spread and cook while the yolk stayed just soft enough to mingle with the crispy potatoes. When you broke into those yolks, they created their own sauce, coating everything with a rich, velvety sheen. The finished dish tasted far more luxurious than the ingredients suggested, a reminder of how your grandmother could make a feast from almost nothing. On Christmas Eve, that skillet of hash felt like home. Christmas Eve bean soup. Number 22 is Christmas Eve bean soup, and this wasn't just any bean soup. Grandma would start with the cheapest dried beans she could find, usually navy beans or pintos, and she'd soak them overnight. In the morning, she'd drain them and tip them into the biggest pot she owned, the one with the enamel chipping off the handle, but still going strong after 20 years. If she was lucky enough to get a leftover ham bone from the butcher for a few cents, she'd drop it in with a kind of reverence, knowing it would flavor the entire pot. If not, she'd use a scrap of salt pork or even just a spoonful of bacon grease, because she understood better than anyone how far a little seasoning could go. As the pot simmered throughout the day, the scent of beans, pork, and onions drifted through the whole house, settling into the walls like a memory that would never fade. She'd check the pot every hour, giving it a gentle stir with a wooden spoon worn smooth from decades of use. Carrots or celery made it in if they were around. But the beauty of this soup was its simplicity. By late afternoon, the beans had softened into creamy perfection, and the ham bone, if she had one, released every bit of flavor it had left to offer. When she ladled the soup into bowls, it felt hearty enough to quiet even the hungriest stomach. Christmas cornbread. Stuffing. Coming in at number 21 is Christmas cornbread stuffing, but this wasn't made with store-bought cornbread. It started by baking a skillet of cornbread early in the day using cornmeal, a splash of buttermilk if Grandma had it, and whatever eggs were left in the carton. Once the cornbread was cooled, she'd crumble it into big rustic pieces, letting the texture give the stuffing character, often bacon drippings with a flavor that no store-bought ingredient could match. She'd scrape every bit into the bowl, mixing it with the cornbread until the whole room smelled like savory holiday comfort. If she had homemade chicken stock from bones she'd saved earlier in the week, she'd add it slowly, letting the cornbread absorb each ladleful until it reached that perfect moist but not mushy stage. A pinch of sage or poultry seasoning, if she still had some left from Thanksgiving, added just enough aroma to make the entire house smell festive. She'd spoon the mixture into a baking dish, patting it down gently like she was tucking a blanket around it. The oven transformed it into a golden-topped masterpiece, with the edges turning crisp while the inside stayed soft and full of flavor. When she brought it to the table, it didn't matter that the ingredients were cheap. The dish tasted like a holiday tradition worth keeping. On Christmas Eve, her cornbread stuffing made everyone feel like they were eating something meant just for them. Christmas Eve potato pancakes. Number 20 features Christmas Eve potato pancakes, and these were made from potatoes that might have been getting a little soft, or sprouting eyes. Grandma would grate them by hand on the metal box grater, the one that always threatened to scrape your knuckles if you weren't careful. The grated potatoes would be squeezed in a clean dish towel until the liquid ran out, leaving behind shreds that were perfect for frying. She'd mix them with a beaten egg, a spoonful of flour, and a pinch of salt so small it barely covered her fingertips. When she dropped spoonfuls of the mixture into the skillet, they sizzled into rough-edged rounds that slowly turned golden and crisp as they cooked. If she had apples on hand, she'd simmer them with a little water and sugar until they softened into a makeshift applesauce that tasted better than anything from a jar. Sour cream was a luxury, but if she'd managed to stretch the budget, she'd plop a small spoonful on top like it was the crowning jewel. Eating those pancakes hot from the skillet felt like getting away with something indulgent, even though the ingredients cost next to nothing. Christmas milk toast. At number 19 we have Christmas milk toast, which sounds incredibly simple but was actually quite beloved. Grandma would toast slices of bread until they reached just the right shade of brown, often with uneven spots because the old toaster had a mind of its own. While the bread toasted, she warmed milk on the stove, stirring it patiently so it never scorched. She'd add a hint of vanilla if she had any left, or maybe a sprinkle of cinnamon or nutmeg to make it feel more festive. The scent rising from that pot had a way of settling nerves and quieting squabbles, especially on a busy holiday evening. Once the toast was ready, she'd place the slices in shallow bowls and pour the warm milk over them, letting it soak just enough to soften the bread without turning it to mush. The first bite was always comforting, warm, and familiar, like the culinary equivalent of being wrapped in a quilt. For children, it felt like a treat, something different from the usual dinners and simple enough that even picky eaters welcomed it. Adults appreciated it too, especially when the budget was stretched thin and something gentle felt just right. On Christmas Eve, milk toast didn't need bells or whistles. It carried its own quiet warmth, offering a moment of peace before the excitement of Christmas morning. Liver and onions. Number 18 brings us to Christmas Eve. Liver and onions, and before you wrinkle your nose, hear me out. Liver was incredibly cheap in the 60s and 70s because most people didn't know how to cook it properly, but your grandmother did. She knew the secret to making liver tender rather than bitter, and it started with soaking the slices in milk until they mellowed out. She'd dry them carefully, dredge them lightly in flour, and heat the frying pan until it was just right. The onions would go in first, sliced into long ribbons that softened and caramelized as they cooked, giving off a sweet aroma that filled the whole kitchen. Once the onions were golden, she'd push them aside and add the liver, searing each piece quickly so it stayed tender. The sizzling sound signaled that supper was well on its way, even if the ingredients looked humble. She knew exactly how long to cook each slice, never leaving it long enough to get tough. When everything was finished, she'd pile the onions back on top, letting their sweetness mingle with the savory flavor of the liver. Served with mashed potatoes made from whatever tubers were left in the bin, the meal felt hearty and satisfying. On Christmas Eve, this dish reminded everyone that even the most economical ingredients could come together into something warm, filling, and full of the quiet confidence of a home cook who knew her craft. Christmas tuna casserole. Next is Christmas tuna casserole. But this wasn't the heavy cream of mushroom soup version you might be thinking of. She'd start by boiling a bag of egg noodles, stirring them occasionally so they didn't clump together, while the steam fogged up the kitchen windows. In a separate saucepan, she melted butter and whisked in flour with the certainty of someone who had made white sauce hundreds of times. Milk went in slowly, and she'd whisk until the sauce thickened into a silky base that smelled faintly sweet. She'd fold in canned tuna next, the kind from the bargain shelf that tasted better than anyone expected once it mingled with the sauce. Frozen peas were added if she had a bag tucked away, but if not, she'd chop up whatever vegetables were lingering in the crisper. The mixture was poured into her favorite baking dish, the one with the faint discoloration along the rim that marked years of holiday meals. She'd top it with breadcrumbs tossed in a spoonful of melted butter, knowing that golden crust would make the dish feel more festive. As it baked, the scent of creamy noodles and savory tuna filled the house, drawing curious glances from anyone passing through the kitchen. When the casserole emerged bubbling and lightly browned, it carried a sense of comfort far greater than the cost of its ingredients. Pork and beans. At number 16, we have pork and beans, but these weren't straight from a can. Grandma always started with dried beans because they cost pennies and could feed the entire family with leftovers for days. She'd rinse them until the water ran clear, then set them to simmer with the cheapest pork she could find, often just fatty bacon ends or a small piece of salt pork. The scent of beans slowly softening in the pot would drift through the kitchen, mingling with the rich aroma of pork breaking down into tender bits. She might add onions, a spoonful of brown sugar, or a drizzle of molasses if there happened to be some left from baking. Every addition was deliberate, measured not in cups but in instinct. The pot would bubble on the back burner all afternoon, giving the beans time to absorb every flavor. She stirred the pot occasionally, listening to the soft, thick sound that told her the dish was coming together. By the time the sun set, the beans had transformed into something rich and hearty, a dish that filled the stomach and warmed the spirit. Served with slices of cornbread or leftover rolls, it felt like a feast made entirely from leftovers and know-how. This dish would feed a crowd for very little money. Scrambled eggs with whatever, and the whatever part was the key. She'd crack eggs from the carton, whisking them with brisk, rhythmic strokes that released their bright, familiar scent. Into the bowl went bits of leftover vegetables, peas, peppers, onions, sometimes even tiny pieces of ham or cheese if they were available. If the bread was getting stale, she'd tear it into small pieces and toss it into the skillet first to toast, creating a base that soaked up flavor like a sponge. When the eggs hit the hot pan, they puffed up in golden folds, wrapping themselves around whatever odds and ends she'd added. She stirred the mixture gently, letting the edges set before folding everything together into one satisfying mound of color and texture. The result was different every time, which somehow made the dish feel special. She would serve it with a side of canned fruit if she had any left, adding a bright contrast to the warm, savory eggs. On Christmas Eve, this simple dish tasted like cozy improvisation, proof that resourcefulness could transform even the smallest scraps into something filling and memorable. Cabbage rolls. Coming in at number 14 is Christmas Eve cabbage rolls, and these were a masterclass in stretching ground meat. Grandma would blanch the cabbage leaves first, dropping them into boiling water until they softened just enough to fold without tearing. The kitchen filled with steam that fogged up her glasses, but she never missed a beat. In a mixing bowl, she combined the cheapest ground meat she could afford with cooked rice, chopped onions, and seasonings she'd measured by feel rather than by spoon. The filling was humble, but she knew exactly how to coax big flavor from small amounts. Each cabbage leaf was spooned with a modest portion of the mixture, then rolled tightly and tucked like a tiny green package. She'd line them up in a baking dish, fitting them snugly so they held their shape. A sauce made from canned tomatoes or leftover tomato juice was poured over the top, adding acidity that balanced the richness of the meat and rice. The tray baked slowly, filling the house with an aroma that felt comforting and slightly tangy. By the time they were done, the cabbage was tender, the filling was savory, and the sauce had thickened into something that begged to be spooned over mashed potatoes. Tomato soup and grilled cheese. Number 13 brings us to Christmas Eve, tomato soup and grilled cheese. This wasn't just a meal. It was a small moment of comfort in a season when money ran thin, but love still ran deep. Your grandmother would pull out a can of tomato soup from the pantry, often Campbell's because it was cheap, reliable, and always tucked behind the flour or sugar. She'd whisk it together with water or milk, depending on what she had left in the fridge, stirring it patiently until it warmed into that familiar rosy color that felt like a hug in a bowl. The aroma drifting from the pot was simple but irresistible, a mix of tangy tomatoes and gentle warmth that signaled supper was nearly ready. Meanwhile, she'd set up her assembly line for grilled cheese, usually with whatever bread was on hand, sometimes day-old white bread from the day-old rack at the grocery store, and slices of American cheese wrapped in that unmistakable thin plastic film. She'd butter the bread with practiced speed, never wasting a drop, and lay each sandwich in the skillet where it sizzled softly as it browned. The sound of that sizzling was as comforting as the crackle of wrapping paper waiting for the next morning. She'd press each sandwich gently with her spatula, ensuring the cheese melted into a smooth, gooey layer that glued the whole thing together. When she sliced the sandwiches on the diagonal, it felt like a tiny holiday ritual, revealing the melted cheese stretching slightly at the cut. Paired with the warm, steaming soup, the combination was somehow simple and magical all at once. It was a meal that filled bellies without emptying wallets, a supper that made the kitchen feel cozy even if the weather outside wasn't cooperating. Christmas Eve meatloaf. At number 12, we have Christmas Eve meatloaf, but this wasn't your typical meatloaf. Grandma would start by stretching the ground meat as far as it could possibly go, adding breadcrumbs, oats, or even leftover mashed potatoes, depending on what needed using up. She'd crack an egg into the bowl and toss in chopped onions that she sliced so finely they practically melted during baking. Her hands mixed everything together with a kind of confidence that only came from years of making dinner happen, no matter what the budget looked like. The mixture was shaped into a loaf by hand, pressed together tightly enough to hold but never packed so firmly that it baked up tough. Before it went into the oven, she'd brush the top with a mixture of ketchup and brown sugar, giving it a glossy, sweet, savory glaze that caramelized perfectly as it cooked. The smell drifting through the house was unmistakable. Warm, homey, and a little tangy from the ketchup heating in the oven. She'd listen for the faint bubbling sound from the pan that told her the meatloaf had reached that perfect juicy stage inside. When she sliced it, each piece held together but still showed the soft, tender texture created by all those careful add-ins. Served with whatever sides she had left, maybe canned green beans or potatoes mashed with a little evaporated milk, it tasted far better than its price tag suggested. One meatloaf could feed a family for dinner with leftovers for sandwiches the next day. Chicken and dumplings. Number 11 features chicken and dumplings. But the chicken was usually just the cheapest parts your grandmother could buy, often necks, backs, and wings. She'd simmer these bony pieces for hours to make a rich stock, then remove the bones and shred any meat that came off. The dumplings were made from simple flour, baking powder, and milk, dropped by spoonfuls into the simmering broth. The result was an incredibly comforting, soul-warming meal that felt like a warm hug on Christmas Eve. Shepherd's pie. Coming in at number 10 is shepherd's pie, which was the ultimate way to stretch a small amount of meat into a full meal. Your grandmother would brown whatever ground meat she could afford, add some onions and whatever vegetables she had on hand, then top it with mashed potatoes made from potatoes that might have been getting a little soft. The whole thing would go into the oven until the potato topping was golden and crispy. The contrast between the savory meat filling and the creamy potato topping was pure comfort food perfection. When she finally served it, each scoop revealed warm layers of meat, vegetables, and creamy potatoes nestled together. On Christmas Eve, it tasted like comfort built from scraps, a true reflection of making the best of what you had. Christmas biscuits and gravy. Number 9 brings us to biscuits and gravy, which was breakfast for dinner on Christmas Eve in many households. Your grandmother made her biscuits from scratch, stirring together flour, baking powder, and salt with practiced hands. She'd cut in lard or shortening until the dough resembled coarse crumbs, then add just enough milk to bring everything together. The dough was patted out by hand on the kitchen counter, lightly dusted with flour, and cut into rounds with a drinking glass. They baked into soft, tender biscuits that filled the kitchen with a warm, buttery scent. For the gravy, she'd brown whatever sausage she could afford, breaking it into tiny pieces so it stretched further. If sausage wasn't in the budget, she used bacon drippings instead, whisking in flour to create a roux before pouring in milk. The gravy thickened slowly, taking on a rich, savory flavor that made the biscuits taste even better. When she ladled the gravy over the split biscuits, it seeped into every nook and cranny, creating a meal that felt comforting and familiar. On Christmas Eve, biscuits and gravy felt like a warm blanket after a long day, a dish that turned simple ingredients into something worthy of gathering around the table. Pancakes for dinner. At number 8, we have pancakes for dinner, which might sound strange but was actually quite special. Your grandmother would make pancakes using flour, eggs, milk, and a little baking powder, but she'd dress them up for the holiday. Maybe she'd add a tiny bit of vanilla to the batter, or serve them with homemade syrup made from brown sugar and water. Sometimes she'd even add bits of apple if she had any, or make them extra thin like crepes pancakes for dinner. Felt special and different, and they were incredibly economical to make. Christmas macaroni and cheese. Number 7 features macaroni and cheese, but this wasn't from a box. Your grandmother would boil elbow macaroni until tender, then make a cheese sauce from scratch using butter, flour, milk, and whatever cheese she could afford. Often this was just processed American cheese, but she'd make it taste special by adding a tiny bit of mustard powder if she had it. or even just a pinch of paprika on top. The mac and cheese would be baked until bubbly and golden, creating a meal that felt indulgent and special. The scent drifting through the kitchen was rich and comforting, a reminder that warm, cheesy casseroles were often the heart of mid-century holiday meals. When the dish emerged bubbling from the oven, it felt like a warm invitation to gather around the table. On Christmas Eve, macaroni and cheese like this filled the room with a kind of cozy joy, proof that simple ingredients could still create something special. Christmas Eve chili. Christmas Eve chili was your grandmother's way of feeding a full table using the smallest possible amount of meat. She'd brown the ground beef first, breaking it into tiny crumbles so it stretched further, letting the aroma drift through the kitchen as the meat sizzled. Then came the onions, softening in the pan and releasing a sweetness that balanced the heat of the chili powder. She sprinkled on top, she'd pour in canned tomatoes, beans, and whatever vegetables she had around. Sometimes corn, sometimes peppers, creating a pot full of color and texture. The mixture simmered for hours on the stove, gently bubbling and sending up a scent that wrapped itself around the house like a warm scarf. She stirred occasionally, checking the thickness with a practiced eye, knowing exactly when the flavors had melded enough to taste just right. If crackers or cornbread were available, she set them out alongside the pot to make the meal stretch even further. Despite being made from inexpensive ingredients, the chili tasted rich, hearty, and perfectly suited for a cold December night. It was the kind of meal that warmed everyone from the inside out, especially after a day spent wrapping gifts or coming in from the chilly air. On Christmas Eve, a bowl of chili felt like a small luxury, a reminder that warmth didn't need to be expensive. It just needed a little spice and a lot of care. Christmas pot roast. Christmas pot roast was one of those meals your grandmother prepared with patience and quiet confidence, even when the cut of meat came from the markdown section. She'd start by searing the tough roast in a hot skillet, letting the surface brown and caramelize until it developed a deep, savory aroma. Then she'd transfer it to her heavy roasting pan, the one with scratches from years of holiday meals, and surround it with potatoes, onions, and carrots. A splash of water or broth went in next, sometimes enhanced with a bouillon cube if she had one tucked away. The pot roast would cook low and slow for hours, filling the house with a smell that made everyone peek into the kitchen to see how much longer it would be. Steam would fog up the oven door as the meat gradually softened, breaking down into tender pieces that yielded at the slightest touch of a fork. Your grandmother always knew exactly when it reached that perfect stage. Not too dry, not too tough, but just right. The vegetables, softened in the flavorful broth, tasted like they'd absorbed every bit of holiday anticipation. When she placed the pot roast on the table, it carried a sense of celebration, even though it had cost very little. Christmas Eve meatballs. Christmas Eve meatballs were your grandmother's way of making a pound of ground meat feed a table full of hungry faces. She'd combine the meat with breadcrumbs, eggs, and onions, adding just enough seasoning to bring the mixture to life. To stretch the meat further, she often added oatmeal or crushed saltine crackers, which absorbed flavor beautifully and kept the meatballs tender. She shaped each meatball with care, rolling them between her palms until they were smooth and perfectly sized. In the skillet, they sizzled softly as they browned, scattering the kitchen with an irresistible savory scent that made everyone eager for supper. Once browned, the meatballs went into a pot of tomato sauce or brown gravy, depending on what ingredients she had on hand. They simmered slowly, absorbing the flavors of the sauce, while becoming even more tender. She'd often serve them over rice or noodles, both inexpensive options that helped stretch the meal even further. Every forkful offered a comforting mix of savory meat and warm, seasoned sauce. Even though the ingredients were simple, the meatballs tasted like something that took much more effort and expense. On Christmas Eve, meatballs felt like a gathering dish, warm, filling, and made to be shared. Cornflake chicken. Cornflake chicken was the kind of dish your grandmother made when she wanted something that felt special without spending more than a couple of dollars. She'd buy the cheapest chicken pieces she could find, usually thighs, drumsticks, or the family pack of mixed parts wrapped tightly in thin butcher paper. Then she'd set a cereal box on the counter, often the off-brand cornflakes she saved for baking, not breakfast, and pour a heap into a plastic bag. Crushing the flakes was half the fun. She'd roll a heavy drinking glass over the bag until the flakes turned into golden crumbs, the sound crackling like tiny festive fireworks. In another bowl, she'd whisk an egg with a splash of milk, creating the simple binder that helped every crumb cling to the chicken. Each piece was dipped, coated, and pressed firmly into the cornflake mixture until it wore a thick, crunchy jacket. As she arranged the pieces on a greased baking sheet, the flakes sparkled under the kitchen light, making the dish look far fancier than its humble origins. The oven would warm the kitchen with that slow, toasty aroma of cereal caramelizing on chicken skin, a scent so unique it became its own kind of holiday memory. Pork chops and applesauce. Coming in at number 2 is pork chops and applesauce, which was elegant in its simplicity. Your grandmother would buy thin pork chops, which were much cheaper than thick ones, and cook them quickly in a hot pan. She'd make applesauce from apples that were getting soft, cooking them down with a little water and sugar if she could spare it. The sweet applesauce paired perfectly with the savory pork chops, creating a meal that felt special and traditional. She'd serve them side by side on plates that didn't match, but no one cared because the flavors were perfect together, the savory pork and sweet apples creating a combination that felt comforting and familiar. It was a meal that tasted far more luxurious than it cost, made with ingredients that stretched just far enough to feed everyone at the table. On Christmas Eve, pork chops and applesauce felt like a quiet celebration, the kind built from thrift, warmth, and the kind of love that didn't need to announce itself. Christmas Eve French toast. And finally, at number 1, the most beloved and remembered Christmas Eve dish from this era, Christmas Eve French toast. But this wasn't breakfast food. This was dinner, and it was made from bread that was getting stale and would otherwise be thrown away. Your grandmother would whisk together eggs and milk, dip thick slices of day-old bread in the mixture, and cook them in a buttered pan until golden brown. But here's what made it special for Christmas Eve. She'd often add a tiny bit of vanilla to the egg mixture, or sprinkle the finished toast with cinnamon and sugar if she had it. Sometimes she'd serve it with homemade syrup or even just butter and a dusting of powdered sugar. The bread would be crispy outside and custardy inside, and somehow this simple dish made from ingredients that cost almost nothing felt more special and memorable than any expensive meal. What's remarkable about all these dishes is that they weren't just born out of necessity, they were expressions of love and creativity. Our grandmothers understood that the most important ingredient in any meal isn't expensive protein or exotic seasonings. It's the care and attention that goes into preparing it. They knew how to take the humblest ingredients and transform them into something that felt special, something that created memories that would last for decades. These women were operating under constraints that would challenge even the most experienced cooks today. They didn't have the luxury of running to the store for missing ingredients. They couldn't order specialty items online, and they certainly couldn't afford to waste anything. Every ingredient had to earn its place in the meal, and every technique had to be mastered because there was no room for error when feeding a family on such a tight budget. As we've explored these 25 forgotten dishes, I hope you've gained a new appreciation for the ingenuity and skill of previous generations of home cooks. These weren't just recipes. They were survival skills disguised as comfort food. They represent a time when cooking wasn't just about following instructions from a cookbook or video, but about understanding ingredients, trusting your instincts, and making something delicious from whatever you had on hand. If you enjoyed this journey through forgotten Christmas Eve dishes, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next video.